It seems like lately anything Vladimir Putin says is scaring the bejesus out of the Western mainstream media. Here he is in India talking about Russia's goals.
For 8 years, we did not recognize the self-declared republics. For 8 years, they have declared the independence, and we were trying to build relations between the rest of Ukraine and these republics. When we understood that it's impossible, that they're simply being destroyed, we were forced to recognize them, and not simply recognize them as their partial territory, but within the administrative borders, when they existed back in the Soviet times, and later during the times of the independent Ukraine, after it gained independence. In the administrative limits. So the people, the voters, came to the referendum and voted for everyone to withdraw troops from there and not to conduct any armed actions there. But they preferred to wage war. And now it all came to a head. And it all comes to one thing. Either we do that through military action, will liberate the territories, or the Ukrainian troops will withdraw and leave these territories and stop killing people there.
Your commentary on the battlefield, what is happening, and where do these comments factor in? Because the Western mainstream media is now freaking out about Putin promising to liberate the territories east of Ukraine.
Look, in 2023, after the failed Ukrainian summer counteroffensive, I said that the war is over. Now, I pointed out that just like in World War II, the Battle of Kursk marked the turning point, but there's still a lot of fighting left to be done. And, the death of Ukraine would take some time. But when you look at military algorithms, and it's what I did for a living, the fact of the matter is Russia had mastered the algorithm of attrition. That Russian defense industry was outpacing NATO and American ability to resupply Ukraine, and the Russian military was killing Ukrainians at a rate quicker than Ukraine could replace them, and the Russian military was growing, not shrinking. And that basically military math dictated an outcome there. Russia would get Ukraine to the point where it can no longer sustain cohesive defensive structures along the totality of the line of conflict, and you would start to see a collapse. Well, we've reached that point, okay? We can now safely say that we have reached the point where Ukraine has run out of troops, and they literally gaps are appearing in the Ukrainian defensive lines that can't be plugged. There's nobody to plug them with. They've lost too many irreplaceable troops, too much command and control, too much equipment. It can't be replaced. Russia is getting stronger. Ukraine's getting weaker. But Ukraine before used to be able to, throw in troops to plug a hole, and Russia just had to grind them down. And now we're at the point where there's no troops left to plug a hole. Russia's ground them down, and you're starting to see Russia make more impressive gains. They seized more territory last week than they did in the entire month before. And I think you're going to see going forward, Russia will be taking more and more territory. We're looking at potential total collapse of the Zaporizhia front, which will be disastrous for the Ukrainians because that'll allow Russia to roll right up the Dnieper River, get across the Dnieper River, pivot south, and take the right bank of Kherson, threaten Mykolaiv and Odessa in the process. And there's no Ukrainian defenses there. The same thing right now in Donetsk. If the Zaporizhia front collapses, Russia pivots north, and now you're looking at a major pincer coming out of Kharkov, out of the Kharkov region, south, and the Ukrainians will have no choice but to evacuate the totality of the Donbass or lose everybody. And if somehow they manage to stabilize the front, still they're dying a death of 1,000 cuts. The 25th Brigade, the 38th Marine Brigade, two of Ukraine's best brigades, are surrounded south of Pokrovsk. They're not getting out of it. They're going to die. The Ukrainian government has abandoned these troops. They've asked for permission to evacuate. The Ukrainian government won't let them evacuate. They're out of food. They're out of ammunition. They're out of fuel. And now they're going to die. These orders have been made public. It's widespread discussed in the Ukrainian media. And now you have territorial brigade commanders saying if they abandon their two best brigades, what are they going to do to us? Ukrainian soldiers are refusing now to fight and die. Desertion rates are at a record high. We just see cases where entire battalions and brigades leave the battlefield because they don't want to be surrounded. This is what's happened in Zaporizhia. And so it's over. I mean, they're still fighting. I remind people that the bloodiest month of World War II for American forces in Europe wasn't June, D-Day, going across the beach in Normandy. It wasn't the Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't Aachen or Hurtgen Forest. It was April 1945, the last full month of the war, where the German army was defeated. The German army fought hard, and America lost more troops that month than we lost in any other month in the European theater. So there's still a lot of hard fighting left. But the Russians have mastered the tactic. This is the other thing people don't understand. The Russian army that's fighting today is not the Russian army that started this conflict in 2022. It's a completely different Russian army from top to bottom. Everything about it has changed. The way they fight, with the weapons they fight, the doctrine that they fight with, how they're supported logistically, their command and control relationships, everything fundamentally changed. The Russian army today is finely tuned for the reality of large-scale ground combat, and they're able to sustain this model successfully. All this crap you hear about Russian meat grinder assaults, the infantry waves coming in, it doesn't work that way, guys. The Russians come in, 3 6s and 9s. Sometimes they'll move 15 guys, but drone warfare dictates that you don't do those kind of open field assaults. Do they get caught out? Yeah, I was just in Russia, and while I was there, there was a specific unit that I had been in contact with through an intermediary, a Storm Z unit, the assault unit, that had a history of successful assaults. They got caught out. 15 guys got in a bad situation. They got hit by Ukrainian drones. Half of them were killed. The other half were wounded. In order to self-evacuate, because the Ukrainian drones were causing a huge problem, a seriously burned guy had to walk 20 kilometers on his own to get to a point where he could be evacuated to medical assistance. He's now in the hospital getting treatment, and he'll live. But it was a bad day for Russian troops. The Russian troops do have bad days, but that's happens rarely on the battlefield. What happened after that? The Russians stabilized the front, threw in their drone capabilities, pushed the Ukrainian drones out, achieved drone dominance, and killed all the Ukrainian drone operators and continued their advance. This is the reality. Ukraine has localized successes, counterattacks, etc., but they don't achieve any operational or strategic advantage for Ukraine. It buys them time for their inevitable death. The casualty ratios on the battlefield are unrealistically high in favor of Russia. What I mean by unrealistically, when you look at the numbers, the reality of these numbers, you say that's impossible to achieve. How can Russia advance? Normally, that's a 3-to-1 advantage you need to have. The Russians are attacking, not with 3-to-1 advantages, and the casualties they're achieving right now, 15, 20, 30-to-1. That means they're killing 15 to 20 to 30 Ukrainians for every Russian that dies. That's the reality. That's the reality that Donald Trump has woken up to, by the way. He used to think that the Russians were taking a lot of casualties because Keith Kellego's telling this nonsense. It's not happening. The Russians are losing men. It's a tough war. The Ukrainians are tough fighters. But the Russians have total dominance right now. Even in drones, I had a fascinating dinner with a Russian frontline drone commander, and I said, who's better at drone warfare, Russia or Ukraine? He said, Ukraine's really good. They're really good. And they tactically and operationally, they might have a slight advantage over us. He said, but they can't sustain it. They'll come in and they'll achieve an objective for a day or two, but then we just come in with overwhelming force. He said, the other thing he said is, we're getting better. We're as good as they are in most places, and getting better than they are in some places, but he says we'll have total drone dominance. Ukrainians won't stand a chance because we've mastered this. We just now did make it a systemic mastery. And that's the difference between Russia and all the other forces out there. The Russians have adapted to this reality. They have learned their lessons. They have gone in, they've taken it up to the general staff. They've invented new doctrine. They take it down to the training. The Russian forces, the Ukrainian forces are stuck on the battlefield. They're stuck in the trenches. They die, they surrender, they get killed. The Russians attack, and then they get rotated out. They get rotated home. They can be with their families. Their morale's high. And then they get rotated to a training center where they're updated with the most recent tactics that are derived from the reality. It takes the Russians a matter of days or weeks to learn a lesson, get it up, get a doctrinally approved day on the training center, and then off to the battlefield. They've adapted to this. It's an amazing reality of the Russian military today that the West has totally missed.
This is how the European, especially Western mainstream media, is taking these comments that Scott just elaborated so much on. Kremlin leader signals he won't back down from his maximalist Ukraine war goals?
Well, there you go. Maximalist. They're willing to settle for what they were willing to settle with in April of 2022. Now, of course, facts on the ground show that they can settle for much more and will insist on that. The backdrop of all this, if you look at how Trump is looking at all this, he knows that Biden was poorly served by the intelligence given to him, first and foremost by that woman, Avril Haines, who is the director of national intelligence, who told Biden in December of 2022, don't worry, we've got it made. The Russians are losing on the front. They're not able to replace the weapons that they're just leaving behind them or destroyed. They don't have any indigenous capability to replace those weapons. Don't worry about it. We got it made. She said that publicly. Imagine she must have been telling Biden that privately. Half a year later, in July, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, told the president to say in Helsinki in a formal address, Putin has already lost. Okay. Now, where did Bill Burns get that information? Well, I traced it back and, he just came from Kiev. And he talked with Zelensky and he said, I have to advise the president on what's going on. And what has it looked? And Zelensky says, we got it made. No problem. Russia has already lost. So that's the backdrop here. Then you have Kellogg telling just 4 months ago, telling Trump, look, we could still win. The Ukrainians are still, Russians are on the back foot. They're losing hundreds of thousands of men. Their economy is falling apart. So now, all of a sudden, about 6 weeks ago, Trump gets the real spiel, okay? He fires Kellogg, marginalizes Rubio, and says, okay, now, what am I going to do? Just at that same time, Putin has a big press conference sort of with a kind of a forward post. He's briefed by the chief of staff, Gerasimov. Okay, he's getting fatigued. So he says, now, tell me, how are we doing on the front? And is it true that we have two major areas, Pokrovsk and one other, surrounded so that there are 10,500 Ukrainians that can't get out? Is that true? Yes, sir. Well, don't kill them all, for God's sake. Please, don't destroy them. Give them a chance to surrender, for God. Yeah. Do they know that they have a chance to surrender? They can't get out. Well, yes, they do know that. Okay, well, they didn't pay much heed because, as Scott has said, Zelensky wouldn't give them permission to surrender. So a lot of them trying to get out anyway. Most of those people are getting killed. So what's the point here? At the same little headquarters briefing, Putin says, no, General Gerasimov, you told me about this new weapon, Burevestnik, but I forget. Tell me, how far did it fly? Oh my God, 14,000 kilometers. And how long did it stay up in it? Oh my, and where can it go? Oh, it's a cruise missile, but in other words, we have not only Oreshnik, we have Burevestnik, and we have Poseidon, which Putin also advertised a couple of weeks later. So the strategic situation is clear. The Russians have the advantage now. I mean, they really do. I mean, we're both going to be dead if they're used, but the Russians have some things that we don't have, okay? Now, the rest of it is that the way things are playing out, demilitarization means either having all these guys surrender or desert, try to get out, or be killed. Now, that's the situation that Trump has kind of recognized now. And he says, okay, well, I'll take the high road and say, let's end this damn thing and prevent 50 to 60,000 more people from being killed when that territory, Trump says this, when that territory will probably be occupied by the Russians anyhow, no matter what we do. So they're all coming together here. And as I say, I'm really shocked at the pace with which all this is happening. In other words, Witkoff and Kushner weren't home a day before they invited the Ukrainians to come back to Miami and tell them what's going on. So, by Christmas or by the turn of the year, we're not going to have a settlement, but we may have something like a framework agreement where finally Ukraine will say, okay, we don't want to become part of NATO anymore. And what will the Europeans do? They'll jumping down, and then they won't be able to do anything because they don't have any money, they don't have any weapons, and they don't have any troops worth speaking of.
Especially in relation to Pokrovsk, there's constant Western mainstream media headlines, articles talking about Russia's slow pace on the battlefield. Pokrovsk is not taken. It's all, they frame it as claims. Russia claims Pokrovsk is falling. They claim they're doing X, Y, Z on the battlefield. Talk about this. How do you react to this? And I'll pull up a video as you're talking of how Reuters covered the Pokrovsk capture. And it's interesting because they don't show very many Russian forces, as you just described how Russian kind of does things. It kind of aligns with how you described Russia's how they fight on the battlefield.
First of all, you have to understand that we are in the midst of a giant information warfare operation being waged by Ukraine, but directed by the British. The United States is out of it, but the Western media is no longer plugged. Understand that American mainstream media views Trump as the enemy. So they are totally dependent upon European sources of information, and Ukraine in particular. And what we know, and this is, uncontested reality, that the British put a 48-hour gap, had the Ukrainians put a 48-hour hold on developments on the battlefield. So what was being reported was 2 days old. Because they didn't want the reporting to match the Russians. They wanted to create a disparity between the Russian claims and what the West was claiming. So rather than manufacture data, they simply had maps that were 2 days old saying, this is the reality. No, our troops are still here. The Russians were saying, no, we cleared this village out today. But the Ukrainians were saying, no, our reports from Syrskyi is that the troops are still in this village. Well, they were 2 days ago, but they're not now. That's done. That scheme has fallen apart. But that's the thing about Pokrovsk. The idea was to create the impression that the Russians were exaggerating, that the Russians were lying, that the Russians were manufacturing data, that the situation wasn't as bad as it appeared to be. The reality was the situation was very bad. The Russians, I'm not saying that they're 100% accurate 100% of the time. The fog of war is a thing. But again, when this war is all said and done, and I've already done it with the opening, the opening phases of the war, especially after Surovikin came in, you match the Russian claims with the map, and it's sort of exactly what Russia said it was, down to the dead bodies. That the Russians aren't exaggerating. They're not. The one things that the Russians aren't doing is giving you a totally accurate appraisal of their losses. They're very accurate about the Ukrainian losses, but their losses, they're less so. But I interviewed a guy who's very well connected to the Russian Ministry of Defense, and he said, I'm not giving away secrets. It's still something that's closely held. But he said, Ukraine has suffered between 1.5, 1.7 million irretrievable casualties. He said Russia has probably suffered 10%. That number may be adjusted upwards a little bit. So I think the number is 198,000. That's irretrievable. That's dead and permanently disfigured. That's a lot. That's a whole bunch. 4 years, 198,000. But it ain't nothing but the Ukrainians have suffered. But my point is that the Russians are telling the truth about the battlefield state. There is no disconnect. There's no reason for the Russians to be lying. And there's every reason for the Ukrainians to be lying and for the Western media to be lying on behalf of Ukraine. Because when the truth is known, If the full truth was known about the real state of affairs of the Ukrainian military, the war would be over today because the Ukrainian military would surrender because they know they're going to die. Because that's the ultimate outcome here. They're all either going to be surrendered, wounded, or dead. That's it. There's no other outcome. The Ukrainians will not win this war. It's done. All that's left is the killing. And as I said earlier, the last month of the war from World War II is the bloodiest, and there's a chance Ukrainians will fight hard in the last moments. But this war is over. Pokrovsk proves it. Now, the other thing we see about Pokrovsk is how it was, the center of Ukraine's logistical and command and control, the anchor of the Donbass defenses in this region. Pokrovsk is strategic, da-da-da-da-da. But as it falls, it's just another village. Don't worry about it. It's what, Pokrovsk? What, is that on the map even? Oh, I didn't know we were defending Pokrovsk. I mean, this whole idea of minimizing the consequences, but everybody knows how important Pokrovsk was. And the key element is the brigades that were destroyed defending Pokrovsk. These were the best brigades that Ukraine had. They put them in this fight to try and prevent this. Ukraine has done everything to try and prevent Pokrovsk from falling. Again, another battle that will be studied once this war is over and the records can be fully opened is the way the Ukrainians threw their drone force to create a drone wall to stop the Russians. And it was very effective. I mean, I've spoken to Russians who were caught up in this, and it was not a good day for the Russians who were caught out there. You don't have a good day when the drones are overhead and you got nothing. You're just literally a sitting duck. And there was a moment there, a couple days, where the Ukrainians made life a living hell for the Russians there. But then they poured everything, though. The problem is they took all of their drone assets. They poured them in. They brought in freshly trained drone control units, and they're out there throwing their drones in. Tens of thousands of drones, 5 drones per Russian soldier. I mean, they were just doing it. And then the Russians brought in their drone units, and the Russians, are able to do surveillance, and they found where all the Ukrainian drone operators were, and then they killed them all with Iskander missiles, with geranium drones, with artillery. They killed them all, and then they pushed them out. The Ukrainians, it was a Pyrrhic victory because some of the best and brightest drone operators that Ukraine had, freshly trained, highly educated people, are dead, and they can't be replaced. And this is just the reality of Pokrovsk. It was a battle that Ukraine knew they couldn't lose, and they did everything. They lied, they cheated, they stole, they threw in their forces, and they lost. And Russia has won. The battle's over, and Ukraine has nothing to show for it but dead bodies.
Well, I just point out that the Russian name for Pokrovsk is Krasnoarmeysk. Krasnoarmey, that's the Red Army. Okay, so, and in just a couple of weeks, the name will be changed, not to protect the innocent, but to brag about the victors. Krasnoarmeysk will be what Pokrovsk has been called. It was a hub. It's gone. As Scott said, the Ukrainians and the West is making light of it, but it's a big deal. The Russians can go to the Dnieper. Whether they will or not doesn't matter. This is not about gains of location or territory. It's about getting rid of, demilitarizing. That means getting rid of Ukrainian army troops. Now, the Russians are doing that. They have cauldrons. So, what bothers me, and what I made a little note here to mention, is that I don't know what the British, who are usually the authors of false flag operations, of course, the Poles and the others will, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians will cooperate, but I don't know what's in their arsenal that they could use now to disrupt what's going on. I guess I just have to say that since I don't know what's in the arsenal, maybe other people don't either. And what scares me is that they could mount a major attack having to do with a nuclear power station or something like that to derail this whole thing if they could. And that's what bothers me, because they have every incentive to do that now. The British have escaped lots of blame from the Russians. The Russians blame them, but they have not retaliated against them until now. And if the Russians do retaliate against a NATO ally, I think the British should be the head of the line. And, I'm Irish, so I'm a little bit prejudiced, but Jeffrey Sachs is not Irish, he's Jewish. And he says that the British are responsible for just about every evil that's happened in the world for the last several centuries. And if you look at things, you can kind of realize why he says that. And he, of course, is more highly educated professionally than I am.